For the second texture, I'm going to start by creating a new file. So I will go File, New. Once again, I'm going to set this to 256 by 256 and make sure that its pixels, RGB, 8-bit, and everything's the same. And I will hit Create. And I will start by zooming in just a little bit so it's easier to see. And we're going to create a couple of new things. I'm going to start by showing you this gradient tool. In order to do that, I will begin by selecting the colors. So I will select, I'll just keep that blue foreground color. The background color, I'll make this red. And up here, if I go to the first tab, to do a gradient, if I left click and drag, it will create a gradient. Now, gradients can be used in a lot of different and very useful and effective ways. There are different types of gradients. So this one creates a circle, this one creates a radial gradient. So I can play around with the different types of gradients. Once again, I'm just clicking on these buttons up here. I can change the opacity. So if I lower that down, I can do additional gradients on top. And there are a lot of other things I can do to play around with it. For example, if I decide to choose one of these other types of gradients, let me increase that opacity. I can create just individual shapes on here. I'm going to create a new layer so that I can make this stand out a little bit more. Get a nice blue. There are other ways I can adjust gradients as well. So for example, if I double click on it, I can actually add in additional points and adjust the opacity, and points down here to adjust the color. So I can actually get very complex color and transparency gradients. And so now I can get this kind of a shape. Let me step back and add that onto a new layer. You see, I can do that. The next thing I wanted to point out, in addition to these gradients, is the fact that you can use some of the previous tools that you've learned to create entirely new shapes. So for example, if I isolate an area and then I do a gradient within that, hide that layer and this layer, you can see that it can have a powerful effect to create different types of things. So for example, if I come up here, do that base gradient, set it for that center spot, and I can create these types of custom shapes. I can also use, for example, the lasso tool and do a gradient within that. Let me grab the eraser right now to show you that. So if I need to cut into something, and once again, the isolate selection has an effect. So I go select, deselect, and then I'm able to cut into some of these other areas. And so you can start playing with more and more of the tools that you find here, using previous tools that you've learned to be able to create different effects. I also want to talk very briefly about layers themselves and some of the adjustments that you can do with them. For example, if I turn on all of these layers, layer 2 is a little bit too powerful for what I want to have happen. So I can actually drop that down so that this layer is on top of the layer 2. I may want to lower the opacity so that some of that background layer will show up. So if I turn off visibility on those by clicking on the eyes, you can see that I can adjust this opacity all the way up or drop it down. I can also change what type of layer it is. I can make this a multiply, which will darken. I can do a screen. I can do a difference. So if I increase the opacity, you can see that it is creating very, very different effects now. I can also just adjust layers. For example, let me create a new layer. Let's say that I want to have some green stripes through here. I'll just simply start painting. Actually, let me lower that down a little bit more. And there we go. There's my green. But that's on top. I can actually just grab a layer and drop it down below. And so it takes into account the layer hierarchy for where things belong. And then once again, if I want to add additional changes, I can do things like multiply. I can do overlay. I can do, let me go to saturation, not saturation, lighten. That's what I was looking for. So bring that in as an effect. And if I decide this layer 3 is too hard, I can lower that opacity down. And in a lot of other ways, just play around with it. So take what you've learned so far. Once again, use the magnifying glass, use the text tool if you want to. Use the move tool to be able to grab selections, adjust things. So I'm going to take this section, move it over here. Use the marquee select, use the lasso select, play around with the paint tool, adjust colors, try gradients. Just have fun with it. Once again, the more you play around with these tools, the better you're going to get at them. So with these new layers all built and playing around with a few more of the tools, I can then go File, Save, and I will start by saving this as a PSD. So I will call this, I'll actually just grab that so it's easier to do the naming. This will be Texture 2 PSD, so that if I need to come back and make changes, I have those layers so I can. But to make it useful, I need to go File, Save As, and then under the source images for the project, I want to save this as a Targa, and I will change this one's name to Texture 2 Tex Targa. I will save that. Once again, I'm saving this as a 24-bit Targa and selecting OK. In Maya, select this second object. Under the Texture 2 Matte, I will select the checker box next to the color, select File, click on the folder, and select Texture 2, and open. And so now I have two custom textures on two different meshes. For right now, I will File, Save Scene, and I will end this video here and come back for one more video. Actually, one more thing before I go that I better get in really fast. So let me go back to this Photoshop file that I forgot to point out. If I want to do even more with the layers, I can actually duplicate sections of layers and create new forms. So let's say I make a new layer here. I'll actually raise it up. I will go for this orange, so hopefully it'll stand out a little bit more. If I do a gradient, and I will do this transparency gradient. I'll do another one of these little stars right here. And I create a shape. I can then, by having this layer selected, I can do Control J, or on a Mac, Command J, and I can duplicate that entire layer. And so if I grab the Move tool and, once again, let me turn off Auto Select. Make sure I have that layer 5 selected. Grab the Move tool. I can move this piece around and I can adjust it. I can also adjust individual pieces. If I come up here to Edit Transform, or to Free Transform, on PC it's Control T, I believe it's Command T on a Mac. That allows me to do things like rotating and scaling, and then if I hit Enter to close that, then I've got this new shape that can be created. I can then take multiple layers, so grab one, Shift select the other, and right click and I can merge layers, and then that becomes one piece that can then be, so Control J or Command J to duplicate that, and then Control T or Command T on a Mac to duplicate that, and I can create these additional sections. And so you're able to work within layers and create a lot of information that can be used in different ways. For example, if I grab that layer 4, I can also come down here to duplicate layer by right-clicking and going Duplicate Layer, hitting OK. If I do Control T, I can take this and adjust it, hit Enter to close that, and I've got this new section here. Up here on this layer 5 copy 2, I can also grab just a portion of it, or actually I'll do this layer 3 right here. If I grab just this piece and I do Control J, it will only take that selection into a new layer that can then become a standalone layer. Once again, Control T, or if you're on a Mac, Command T to do the transform, Enter to close that. And you can see that there's a lot you can do playing around with different layers and pulling out different sections. So if you need to do something like texturing a road and you paint up a nice section of gravel, you can duplicate that, adjust it, and tweak it to get your base layer that you would then do a final polish paint over top, but it would get you the foundational gravel layer. So this is something that you can play around with, yet again, just as another tool. So since I've made changes, I'll go File, Save, and you see it's saving the PSD, so I'll also need to go File, Save As, and I will need to come to the source images, Targa, make sure I select that texture 2 again, save. Yes, I want to replace it, 24-bit Targa. And then when I come back to Maya, in many cases it will automatically update. If it doesn't, just come to the color and select Reload. And you see there it is with the updates. And we'll end this video for here.